The year is 1975. After assembling an Altair 8800 microcomputer kit, Mr. Strickland's shoddy soldering work caused a near-fatal electrical shock when the unit was first powered on, and his brain went into hibernation mode. Fortunately, he just recently awoke, having missed the last 45 years. At the time of his accident, Rudy was researching the use of microcomputers for an application he called Mapping Automation Programming Systems, or MAPS for short. During his comatose state, the technology of GIS was of course developed instead, and he's been coming up to speed in his understanding of the GIS as it relates to the original MAPS research. To aid in his recovery, his specialists have recommended that he share some of his 1975 MAPS predictions. However, he still firmly is convinced that he's in 1975, so his presentation should be viewed in that context.
Rip Van Geowinkle. A Tale of Lost GIS Predictions. Prognostications of a geospatial elder that were developed during the years before his near half-century coma.
Just a brief note, the concept of staging a presentation in a previous time frame is attributable to my virtual colleague, Brett Victor. He has an excellent video at this URL, wherein he imagines the future of the internet and other technology from a 1970s time frame. Back to 1975.
Greetings. I'm pleased to be filming this presentation of my MAPS design concepts. Although still early in its development, it takes advantage of several emerging technologies, and that's what I'd like to share with you today. I understand that the organizers of this conference will be making copies of my overheads available, so I've tried to make them as simple as possible to save on postage delivery costs. Now, if only the planetary data party line technology, which I describe later, were available today, then a digital facsimile of my overheads, or even this entire presentation, could be electronically accessible worldwide. At any rate, let's begin. Here are the 4 key topics that I wish to discuss.
Number 1, and most fundamental, the map system won't store maps per se. That is, it stores data that has a geospatial or locational aspect to it. Let's call each one of these data records in this database a geospatial feature. Features can include many other attributes besides just their locations, such as names, chronologies of creation, and so forth. This is the most important concept, that we're storing geospatial data independently of any specific rendition or pictorial representation of it. Maps are just like any other database report. They're generated dynamically and on demand. All the features are stored one-to-one, that is full size, and at real-world locations defined by measurements such as longitude and latitude. Or more typically, since the world is round and maps are flat, they'll be in projected Cartesian coordinate systems. We're going to talk about more on that in the second topic, creating and managing geospatial databases. This goes into lightly some of the details of storing geographic data or geospatial data in a database. We'll talk then about geospatial database storage on a global scale, how this should be scaled out globally and shared. And finally, a brief prediction of software trends that I hope do happen in the coming years.
Diviser chaque difficulté en autant de parties que possible est nécessaire pour la résoudre.
Okay, well said by this guy, Rene Descartes. And what he did say was start from first principles. Just a brief word about him. He was a French philosopher and mathematician who in the 1600s thought up the notion of plane coordinate systems that specify points uniquely by their offset from two fixed perpendicular lines, right? The XY axes, also usable in 3 dimensions. So our whole basis of points, at least in a Cartesian system, come from this guy. Now, if this weren't enough, he also came up with a pretty hefty tome entitled Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and of Seeking Truth in the Sciences. I've always been an admirer of the principles of solving problems that he put forth in this discourse. I haven't read it all. First few pages were enough, but what he says basically is that you always start from known facts. You divide your problems into as many fundamental parts as possible, and then you work through each part thoroughly and methodically. This logic is what I've tried to apply to major issues all my life up to this point, including the design principles for maps. I hope these overheads are coming out all right. It's a little tricky to adjust them. What we need then is a database system, a computer system to store and manage data. Now, up until the end of the 1960s, all computer database management systems were pretty much developed and are owned by IBM. And they were either network or hierarchical structures. It's not important to go into any detail on either of these in this presentation, other than they are cumbersome to use. However, a version called Information Management System, IMS, got us to the moon in 1969. Just in 1970, or just 5 short years ago, Dr. Edgar F. Codd of IBM thought of a way to make things a whole lot easier. He wrote this paper, a relational model of data for large shared data banks, in which he proposed replacing the current systems of network and hierarchical database management systems with that of tables. Relations, that's what mathematicians call the tables. They are the relations. Relational doesn't refer to the fact that things are related together. At any rate, these tables are structured as matrices of rows and columns. This concept would become known as the relational database management system. In addition to the row column structure, Codd's basic idea was that relationships between data items should be based on the item values and not on separately specified linking or nesting. Hopefully this becomes a little bit clearer as we go along here. Some of you may be familiar with the term spreadsheet, which visually resembles the row column structure of Dr. Codd's relational database management system. In 1961, at the University of California in Berkeley, Professor Richard Matisich developed a computerized application which mimicked the blackboard-based matrices used in business schools. And what's really interesting is this young fellow here. He's an MIT graduate student named Dan Bricklin. He thinks he has a design for a spreadsheet software version that will be able to run on computers like my Altair 8800. That is, once it's fixed. I think in time, spreadsheet software, given that it mimics relational database tables, can become desktop mini geospatial data processing software itself that will be able to do limited, albeit useful, geospatial processing tasks. Let's see how that plays out. Getting to the basics. Given the fact that ultimately we want to use a relational database management structure for maps geospatial data, for any geospatial data, and that the tables, again, the relations, resemble spreadsheets. Now, what would the data records look like? This is no by no means original on my part, but the most fundamental geospatial geometry types are points, lines, and polygons. And actually, the most fundamental of these are points. And here's a prototype format. There's no separate proprietary geometry data structures. The point geometry is in plain text, as we can see here, and within each point table record, along with many other aspatial point name and description attribute fields. Aspatial referring to the fact that they're cool, great information, but they're not necessarily spatial in and of themselves. They relate to the geometry. Finally, we can have line strings, similar sort of structure with the, again, the geometry is appearing as a plain text string. And finally, polygons. Here's a really important point about structuring geospatial data in a relational database format is that the definition of points, lines, and polygons is part and parcel of each database record. There shouldn't be a separation of graphics data, if you will, that is the geometry, from the aspatial attribute data. However, geometry data is somewhat spatial, as well as being spatial. I predict that optimized geometry hardware may be developed to speed up reading and processing point coordinate values in this format. Maybe these could be specialized CPU chips called graphics processing units. Just a thought. As well, geometry data processing will undoubtedly benefit from a suite of software functions, such as determining which points fall within each polygon, intersections of polygon, and so on. Maybe it could be a standard subset of the emerging SQL language that I will talk about later. And now, industry-wide at this time, however, again, 1975, there doesn't seem to be common consensus on this issue of storing geospatial data directly in a relational database. Indeed, what few current geospatial software offerings there are all separate these data components altogether. Here's a system that's being brought to market by a bright chap from Harvard named Dangerman through his company called Esri. Software is called arc/info, and the name clearly defines the difference between graphics, arcs, and I know this may be troublesome to some people. Arcs don't have a curve to them. There's mathematicians define them. They're the connection between two straight line connection between vertex points. Well, past that, here is a Unix. I'm sure you're all familiar with Unix to some degree. This is a directory in Unix that has many different files to define the graphics of apparently some river in Ohio. The aspatial attributes, the data attributes, are stored in a separate directory with a lot of files too. And with lots of files, there's lots of opportunities for programs to halt with a dreaded 6 nines error. This is apparently a standard of Esri software where something unexpected caused the tool to fail. Okay, at any rate, I'm not confident that this approach will ever go that far, even though young Dangerman's a charismatic advocate for his software. Here's another commercial approach to geospatial data representation at this point in time. M&S Computing, headquartered in Huntsville, Alabama. M&S has developed a turnkey hardware software system that can perform geospatial data mapping, albeit, again, with a data structure that is similar to ArcInfo. It's proprietary file structure. for graphics, but at this point in time, there's no aspatial data link functionality. Another thing that I find kind of strange about this is that one of the words in the files has the last 6 bits. It's called the element type and level. The last 6 bits represent a level, something they call levels. So things can be assigned a level value. Now, absent explicit aspatial data attribution, some M&S users utilize level numbers to distinguish different geospatial feature types like road center lines or electric utility distribution lines and so forth. This really is a hack, and I'm sure that it's going to be roundly rejected by users in the near future. The important thing you need to store with the geometry itself is, what is this geometry? If we arbitrarily start putting it in different levels or different colors, and it gets away from real flexibility. That's just my opinion. Both Esri and M&S have developed unique file structures to speed up the retrieval and display of geospatial data. That's a worthwhile approach, but I predict it will only be a short-term solution. Although current database geospatial systems lag behind proprietary systems' display speeds, this will be a short-lived phenomenon. Hardware technology will accelerate over the coming years to the point where relational database storage of geospatial data will be the norm. This is what Gordon Moore, who's pictured here, co-founder of Intel Corporation. That's the supplier of the CPU chip in my currently defunct Altair 8800. He said something just 5 years ago in 1970. He predicted that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit board would double every 2 years. And so far, this empirical formula has proven remarkably accurate. And what it basically means is that theoretically, computer circuitry will continue to be denser and faster. I guess up to the limits of the speed of light, how closely you can place things on an integrated circuit board. At any rate, this prediction has become widely known as Moore's law. More CPUs operating parallel will lead to increased speed. Okay, so as well, I predict that we won't be depending on current approaches, rotating magnetic disk storage in desktop microcomputers, too expensive to begin with. Now, although solid state RAM is more expensive, I think it'll soon become denser and faster due to Moore's law, and will become the predominant storage technology for all sorts of computing devices. Let's focus back on the coordinate values in our maps database structure. And what should these values be based on? Again, the world is round, maps are flat, so we need a projected coordinate system. That is, one that systematically transforms things like latitudes and longitudes location from the surface of the globe into Cartesian XY locations on some sort of plane surface. This is good old Descartes at work again. We do have the Mercator projection developed by the Flemish geographer and cartographer Gerardus Mercator way back in 1569. It became the standard map projection for navigation because it is unique in representing north is up and south is down everywhere, while preserving local directions and shapes. Now, we all know the Mercator projection gets to be a progressively fatter lie as latitudes grow to the north and down to the south, as these varying circle sizes show as they get further from the equator. At the equator, they're the same size circle, mathematically defined. It's just that projected with the Mercator projection, they become larger as we go north and south. I guess we really don't care. There's not that many people living, in Greenland anyway, or certainly in Antarctica to make a big case about this. So a predominant coordinate reference system for land surveyors, my particular registration, which I got just this year, is the National State Plane Coordinate System. It was established in 1933. It uses a variety of projections, most commonly transverse Mercator or the Lambert conformal projection. These are constrained within limited geographic areas, such as counties, so as to minimize the inherent projection errors. The State Plane Coordinate System is based on the North American datum of 1927 at this time. Datum is, of course, a formal description of the shape of the Earth, along with an anchor point for the coordinate system. In this case, the anchor point is near the center of the contiguous United States in Kansas. Now, here's a significant issue about state plane coordinate systems, and it relates entirely to our use of coordinates in a geospatial processing system. 4 years ago, in 1971, I was in charge of designing the City of Boulder's survey control network. It was, and still is to this day, a controlled survey of 12 points, one of which was the monumentation atop Bear Peak. Bear Peak's at 8,500 plus or minus feet overlooking Boulder. Now, projecting the geodetic distance of a profile of the control network onto the state plane surface at mean sea level, the geodetic distance on the ellipsoid of the Earth, and finally we project down to, maps are flat, a grid distance on the grid plane of NAD 27 state plane coordinate system, which is defined as average mean sea level. Well, now what happened is that this grid distance, it differs from the actual geodetic difference measured from Bear Peak to Valmont. Let me restate that. The flat Earth distance, as surveyors measure it by leveling, making sure we're taking level shots all the way across this. So that's how we get the actual ground distance. But it differed from Bear Peak to this point on Valmont Bluff by a little over 10 feet, and they're about 8 miles apart. In other areas of the city, across the city, distances measured at ground level differed from the projected state plane distances at sea level by an average difference of a little over 1 foot in each mile of distance. So my control network, now I understand, I just graduated from college, and the only reason I got this job is because I thought that having a degree would make me smarter in these areas. At any rate, this network was kind of roundly rejected by the professional surveyors at the time. What I predict will be the norm in future surveying will be to establish projection planes close to average ground elevations for defined areas. And maybe these localized projection planes will be referred to as ground truth systems. As well, I think it'd be money well spent to establish world datum reference points at the Earth's center rather than at arbitrary ground surface points.
Low distortion projection systems are the future.
Wow, I'm not sure where he came from, to be honest with you, but sometimes my mind plays tricks on me. But yes, I believe that future geospatial coordinate systems will be regionally and or locally referenced to average ground elevations throughout each area of interest. One thing I did forget to mention in the previous overhead was that the accepted unit of measurement, you got to have agreement on that, for state plane coordinate systems will continue forever to be the U.S. survey foot established by Congress in 1866. The influence of surveyors and respect for the history of surveying in the United States demands no less. And I just feel amputating the U.S. survey foot would be sacrilege.
Canada Forestry's Rural Development Branch has designed what I refer to as a Geographic Information System, or GIS for short. It stores and analyzes Canada's land inventory data. This GIS was put into production in 1968 using an IBM System 360 Model 50 with 512 kilobytes of main RAM. It has 6 magnetic tape drives and 3 magnetic disk drives to handle all the map storage. Boundary data is traced from source maps onto clean sheets, then digitized by a drum scanner. A significant capability of the GIS is overlaying up to 8 different maps together, enabling examination of the interdisplayed relationships. Although the Geographic Information System of the Rural Development Branch is still in its early stages of deployment, it is more advanced than any other known major land data bank. It contains many new concepts and technologies, especially those relating to the compact storage of boundary data and the rapid comparison of one map with another.
This gentleman, Roger Tomlinson, is already being referred to as the father of GIS, which is the term now widely accepted for computerized mapping, geospatial mapping systems. In fact, that's the term I'll use for the rest of this presentation, although I don't know how it should be pronounced really, or if even it's a kind of acronym that has an unambiguous pronunciation. I'll continue to say GIS. All right, topic 2, and this won't be nearly as long as the database foundation, which I still consider to be the most important thing that will happen in the next, who knows, 50 years or so. In this section, I'm going to discuss how to leverage relational database technology for the entry and management of geospatial data. As I said, since I've just recently become an Arizona registered land surveyor, my primary interest for GIS is for its use in storing, maintaining cadastral data, that is property data. Given that, here's what I know for sure will become true, that professional land surveyors will become the kings of cadastral GIS. They're the professionally licensed experts in property survey control and boundary data. So I just can't imagine any other outcome in this regard. That's why I'm looking forward to leveraging my land surveying registration. So let's get right to the point. That is how to get these points into cadastral-based GIS. And this is just one example of data that should be coming in through transactions rather than traced from paper maps. So in Roger Tomlinson's land inventory data approach, this first group here, clean maps are manually traced from existing maps. Then those clean maps are digitally scanned and end up in an IBM mainframe system. In other systems like M&S, a digitizing tablet is used, and the coordinates are directly fed into the computer system. Okay, given that, what sort of system or what sort of method should be used for cadastral descriptions like this one? Here's a bunch of words and dimensions and whatnot. Let's say we don't even have a map to trace. Well, the answer is which method should we use? That's easy. Neither one. Building a cadastral GIS from derived maps, paper maps, just doesn't make logical sense. Through the process of map digitizing, we lose so much. We lose the original intent of the described property. The geometry constraints are often ignored altogether, such as parallel street lines, perpendicular lot lines to those streets, and so forth. As well, the chronology of the cadastre up to the point of map tracing is entirely lost. How did the encompassing properties come about that now this new subdivision are going to be within? Now, again, just as solid as my prediction that surveyors will be kings of cadastral GIS, if not the entire profession, if we're tracing maps to create digital cadastres for governmental agencies in the future, I believe we ought to just pack the whole thing up and go home. Promise unfulfilled. Let's look at a real simple example of how this how my map system would handle this. And so we're looking at as simple a land description, legal description as you can get, which says the easterly 100 feet of the northeast quarter of Public Land Survey System, Section 36, Township North, Range 3 East of the Gila and Salt River Baseline Meridian of Maricopa County, Arizona. It's up in the Cave Creek area. So what this describes then is a strip of land, a property that is 100 feet wide. It's a polygon that has a width of 100 feet, coincident on the east side with the east line of the northeast quarter of this section, and with its west line parallel to the east line of the northeast quarter. And the top and bottom lines of the polygon are coincident with the lines of the northeast quarter. It's kind of fast to be going over. Again, to a land surveyor, it speaks real clearly. The important thing is that, all right, how would we get this into the system? Here's what I think. Here's the two maps, if you will. The northeast quarter, section 36, in a certain township and range in Maricopa County. These points defining that quarter section are in a system, which I'm going to call PLSS points. And so their unique ID, the geometry, as we discussed, is point geometry. So here is X and the Y, a spatial attribute of, what do we call this corner? What's its abbreviation or its much more compact description? Finally, what is it physically monumented as? And when was the date that it was entered? These also have Maricopa County recording numbers. Okay, so we got the geometry. Here's the Cadastral Transactions table, which again, each record has a unique ID. This geometry was constructed from this legal description, the easterly 100 feet of, again, Township 6 North, Range 3 East, Section 36, the northeast quarter. It says it was modified in 2020, 06, 02. The reference is 2020. Now I'm going to grant you that this, again, it should be part and parcel of the map system. There's a little bit going on in there to understand this legal description. But again, there's enough words in there that to a surveying head, this comes about. Here's what's really more important about all of this. The definition of this quarter section comes from these descriptions for each record up in the PLSS points. Again, the description of the polygon comes from here, the easterly 100 feet. But if we modify any one of these coordinate values up here with proper metadata, then it flows automatically down to this cadastral transaction, and 0.2704, let's say, gets slightly moved. Well, then the whole polygon will be readjusted to match 0.2704. And of course, that influences line 2672, certainly influences line 2704 to 2753. Here's, well, again, just part of the algorithm, and simple stuff, right? I mean, this is nothing here. How do we find those points of a 100-foot wide strip? Pretty straightforward geometry. Well, of course, to efficiently perform this type of intertable manipulation, we're going to need some sort of procedural language. Excuse me. Fortunately, just last year in 1974, these two gentlemen, Dr. Don Chamberlain, Dr. Ray Boyce of IBM Research of San Jose, developed a structured English query language, SQL, to apply to Dr. Codd's model of relational databases. The term SQL later became just the letters SQL, but it's still pronounced SQL. And some of you may be familiar with its use in System R on IBM mainframes. Here's how SQL select statement, and these are all just prototypes or recommendations at this point in time, but I suspect most of it will become a standard somehow. Here's how SQL select statement could be used to retrieve just certain data records as defined by their unique IDs. Well, what we'd pull to start with would be those points, and we want to get the geometry, right, from these. Want to get the corner description, and we want to get this abbreviated description, the township, range, and section. We want to get the monuments, the physical stuff in the ground that monuments these, the date modified, and the reference. So here would be the SQL statement that would be used to derive this table. Okay, deep enough. Since the maps data is a relational database, the requirement for metadata is easily satisfied. I mean, we got to have some sort of notion about where did this data come from, when was it modified, etc. So we just add a couple of columns, fields to each row. This will ensure we have feature level metadata. There won't be a need for defining, well, it'd be a need for what metadata do we need, but assigning totally separate files that may get lost that describe PLSS points on anything other than a record by record basis that's interesting, but it's not going to be that useful and not going to be maintained. Moving on to geodatabase storage, geospatial database storage on a global scale. How and where should all this data be stored? Here's my thoughts on that. It won't be, or it shouldn't be, stored on individual computers. There's not enough attached memory, either in RAM or disk storage of some sort. Besides, even if millions or billions of bytes of local memory were ever to become available on microcomputer workstations, the notion of storing GIS data locally on individual computers is just patently ridiculous. The data's value and ability to be managed will dictate that it will be stored in central locations to enable distributed user access. This will eliminate downloading GIS data sets and therefore creating mass confusion as to which data is truly the most current and/or authoritative. So let's look at this conceptually in the next overhead. Millions of microcomputer workstations all connected to a centralized GIS databank. This is not one overall database, naturally. It itself is federated or distributed, but the important thing is that these microcomputer workstations can talk to authenticated volumes, containers of geospatial data, as well as to each other. The hardware infrastructure then seems easy enough, right? Miles of fiber lines, as well as some form of land and space-based radio communications. But what sort of software communications mechanism do we need to make all this happen? Well, again, here's kind of my prediction in that regard, backed up by some experts. Dr. Licklider and Dr. Taylor in 1968, not that long ago, said the computer is a communication device. That is, computers are going to talk directly to one another. First sentence says that all men will be able to communicate more effectively through a machine than face to face. So now as well, the foundational electronic infrastructure for worldwide communications has been envisioned and prototyped just less than a year ago in this DARPA Defense Advanced Research Project Agency document. Its fundamental formulation thesis was that differences between network protocols were to be hidden using a common inter-network protocol. Instead of the holistic network being responsible for reliability, each host themselves would become responsible. This document has been coined in this document as CATNet or CatNet for Concatenated Network. I really think a snap your title is needed for this. Until only very recently, some areas of the United States still had telephone party lines where you could pick up your handset and listen in on other party line participants. So my vision is that of a planetary data party line, the PDP, that we will all be able to access and share data conversations on. Getting back to this overhead, we will have repositories of GIS data available through the planetary data party line. Now, I foresee two primary contributing sources for this data. Citizen cartographers voluntarily entering commonly used place data such as road networks. Maybe this could even be called the Open Roads Map, and it would be continually updated again by citizen volunteers to add new roads as well as changing conditions, road construction and whatnot. The other really important contributor to the planetary data party line storage of geospatial information will be authoritative data, such as for the PLS points table that would be entered and vetted by GIS professionals. Now, even in the volunteer data case, there had to be some sort of verification mechanism for the entered data. There's a concept that the philosopher Virgilius Firm, F-E-R-M, referred to as the consensus gentium, Latin for the agreement of the people. In any group activity, there are always going to be more than enough participants eager to point out the fallacy of others' opinions. So this is going to be the case for the Open Roads Map. If inaccurate data is entered erroneously or by intent by some participant, the rest are going to jump on that poor participant and correct the data in short order. Self-policing. All right, finally, GIS software trends. We're going to wrap up pretty quickly here. This is what I hope it will be, or that is, it should be, the trends in software focused on GIS data processing. I sure hope that it doesn't end up like this, where we have competing companies with their own proprietary methods of GIS data storage, processing tools, and even custom, quote, macro languages. In this scenario, we'll end up with a multitude of software castles with their own little moats being isolated by those moats of proprietary application software technologies. Now, what will happen in the end? Only a few monopolies will survive with their proprietary approaches dominating and actually constraining the pace of any real GIS software development. What will happen, of course, is intertribal skirmishes will be the norm. My software is better than your software. Users are going to waste time arguing over trivial technical issues that will, here's the funny thing, that will be otherwise settled in the larger information technology world. Here's what I'll guarantee in this respect, that the real schism will eventually occur between corporate IT departments and GIS groups within an organization. The former, the IT guys, are going to win this war because they'll correctly identify GIS as a data-centric activity that should be using established standards, as well as relational database management systems and SQL language constructs. Again, I can't see this playing out any other way. So what I believe is that the best application software solution for fast evolving technologies like GIS is the open source development model. It's much like the Open Roads Map approach. Open source software is code developed voluntarily that is designed to be publicly accessible. Anybody can see, modify, and distribute that code as they see fit. It is developed in a decentralized and collaborative way by different entities, as you can see here, relying on peer review and community production. So what we have is, rather than profit-focused monopolies that are committed to a particular coding paradigm, the cream of all possible approaches in open source rises to the top. Open source software development is enabled and leveraged by my planetary data party line. Developers will operate in a worldwide cooperative. very quickly, open source, and not going into detail on all of these, but what's the advantages of open source? And I believe it is going to be the future of software development for a lot of things. Lower total cost of ownership. Yeah, it's usually free, right? Has lower upfront costs, but it shifts. What it does for organizations is shift the cost center from licensing, which is an operating expense, to customization and implementation. Greater leverage, but it's also a capital expense. And those of you who have companies or work with the bottom line know how significant this is. The second is, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. This is something a fellow named Linus Torvald is proposing. Basically, open source tends to produce better quality software than its proprietary or alternative counterparts. When you have closed source, that is proprietary software, the only developers that can potentially detect, diagnose, triage, and resolve software bugs are those who happen to be employed by the company that publishes the software. So we got three principal advantages with open source. You have the opportunity to tap the knowledge of the world's best developers, not just those on one organization's payroll. Secondly, the number of potentially contributing developers, thus the potential knowledge pool, tends to be orders of magnitude larger. There's always somebody smarter than you are, than anybody is, right? And so they've got a forum to publish that out there and let the law of the masses determine if it's going to work or not. And finally, open source software gets adapted to a variety of use cases, not just the ones the original publisher decided are important. Since it does have to stay current, technologically, it will stay current with modern practice of software development. When you have problems, the fourth point here, updating is driven by urgency demand. When a proprietary software vendor gets mistakes, everybody gets mistakes in code, but it takes the next release cycle to address a group of those problems. And if your problem is usually pretty urgent, you have to wait weeks or months for that release. The open source is a force multiplier. You stand on the shoulder of giants. When communities form around shared challenges, you get a diversity of ideas that naturally emerges and surfaces better solutions than if the marketplace of ideas was limited to just one profit-driven organization. Here's maybe the most important, and from my standpoint, is the moral imperative of open source software. It can empower users at a time when governments seem to want to restrict their rights. It makes computers accessible to the poor and helps reduce the disadvantages that developing nations face as they build their technical infrastructure. So it will encourage corporations to cooperate for their mutual benefits. And where profits make software for endangered languages unsustainable, it's going to be open source that can provide tools to keep those languages alive. So predictions, again, very briefly, GIS will be based on relational databases. For certain data, we won't be tracing existing maps to create those layers. We're going to have some sort of planetary data party line to communicate together. I really believe that open source software will finally dominate. And this final one is my personal prediction. Surveyors will be the kings of cadastral GIS, if not the whole industry altogether. I hope this has been of some value and that at least some of these predictions will come true.
Thank you, Mr. Stricklan. Does that wrap up? We have a few questions. Did that wrap up are you ready to take questions now?
I am, yes. You hear me okay, Jamie?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Okay, so we do have a couple questions. One actually just seems really important. Just got somebody actually sent it. I got a piece of paper slipped to me since I know you don't understand what texting is. Anyway, it's a surveyor, and he wants to know he's a surveyor. What happens? Where's his crown? Where does he pick up this crown that he's supposed to
Oh,
get?
yeah. You know, I think that's going to be a useful sort of thing. Once we're in the, you know, the catbird seat in GIS, we're going to be richer than all get out. So, you know, I think this would be, you know, some of the marketing swag that we will pass out to lesser mortals. So it'll be coming in time.
Okay, great. Hopefully that says. Okay, so we do have a couple more questions coming in here. We have one from a gentleman named Aaron Seifert, and he would like to say, he says, Mr. Stricklan, what do you think about the developing technology to provide the ability to create and collect data outside of an office and digitizing board for your map system, and via maybe your PDP? He finds it very difficult to bicycle a trail and map it at the same time.
Now this Seifert guy, you know, excuse me, but he, you know, seems kind of lazy, right? You bicycle, you know, you punch in, you carry this Altair isn't that big, Aaron. You know, so you just have it on your bike. But yeah, I think this is a good point. Just as surveying technology has changed so much in, just the 5 years since I've graduated from school. I think there's going to be smaller and smaller devices, or maybe even talk to a device. Now, of course, here's the important thing, you know, if you're going to publish the data to be consumed for public use and therefore be authoritative, maybe you want to engage a practicing surveying professional. What I think Aaron is saying, though, like for trail mapping software, perfectly within people are familiar with the trails to do that mapping. They're going to have smaller devices and, like I say, maybe even headsets they'll talk into.
Okay, great. Hopefully that answered his question. I got another one here for you.
He sounds like a smart aleck, though, but that's neither here nor there.
Okay, so now we have another one, this gentleman from Ben Turner, who says, speaking of the 70s, can you tell me who Ray Manzarek is?
There we go. Of my favorite band, this is a classic rock and roll band, of course, The Doors. Manzarek is the percussionist for this group, a true artist. And I'm glad he brought that up. And there's some important things out there. This is one of those that it's very important. Manzarek is a critical artist in the rock and roll world, or in the music world altogether.
Right. Hey, I wonder, since you're just showing a black screen, maybe, are you able to maybe go back and show so people can look at your predictions while we go through the questions, or not?
Oh, okay. Here it is
All right, maybe just keep that one on the screen.
Okay.
From that. Can you keep it steady?
Yeah, here we go. I've just put it on the overhead.
Okay, great. Thanks for throwing that overhead on there. Okay, we'll just leave that on there while we ask the rest of there's still a couple more questions here. Troy Riora says, I've always known about the divide between GIS and surveyors, but I never knew why they didn't get along. Was there some convention in the 70s or 80s where all the surveyors decided GIS was just silly? Or was it the GIS folks' fault?
Golly, I can't speak to the 80s. I hope that isn't the case. I hope GIS professionals or practitioners at the time would recognize separate areas of expertise, right? And maybe I shouldn't have been so forthright or out there with saying that surveyors will become kings of all GIS. It's not going to be the case. We have the place in the authenticated or authoritative realm of geospatial data. I think, well, again, if I were to guess, I would think that, geez, surveyors, no college degrees, don't know anything really about databases. We don't need them. So I think it may be a typical battle between different groups again, not realizing or understanding that working together would be the best way to work through GIS cooperatively. I hope that gets to it.
Well, I think that sounds like a great answer. All right, we have another one here from Jean-Paul Lavoie. Maybe that's how you pronounce his name. And he says, that is an impressive vision, Rip. Did you come up with this whole geospatial relational database and PDP sharing data idea yourself? Do you think it is likely to occur maybe by the year 2001?
Well, in direct answer to John Paul, I can say, yeah, the PDP is my own thing, and I hope that does come about. Relational databases are Dr. Codd's construct, but using them for GIS, John Paul, I can't see any other way. I mean, can you imagine having separate file structures, you know, maybe call them, well, they're shapes after all, having something like shape files that you base your GIS organizational data on? Never happened. Never happened. So yeah, as far as when this should come about, sooner than later, I'm not sure when would be a good date to predict that, though. Certainly a new millennium ought to bring in new technology, or technology that's recognized for everybody to be the true and correct way to go about business.
Wonderful. Well, that looks like all the questions that we have in the Q&A, which is perfect timing since there's only about 3 minutes left in our session.
Great.
I really want to thank you for presenting this great, your predictions and going over all this important information. I think the audience got a lot out of this. So I really appreciate it. And I want to thank our attendees. Please remember to fill out the survey. And I believe our star of the show here will be briefly in the hospitality suite, in the Zoom room hospitality suite, immediately following this presentation.
That's what I'm understanding. My nurse right beside me here says that maybe just with a little bit of rest, I can get back out there. Can't take any more questions at this time, but I'll be right back.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And everybody, we'll see you in the hospitality suite.